You are thinking right now. You know you're thinking. You can observe your own thoughts as they form. You can step back from them, evaluate them, disagree with them. You have an inner life, a sense of being a self that exists behind your eyes, watching everything happen. This feels so fundamental that it's hard to imagine not having it. But here's what the evidence suggests. For the vast majority of human history, for hundreds of thousands of years of anatomically modern Homo sapiens walking this earth, humans almost certainly did not experience themselves this way. They thought, they felt, they planned and grieved and loved. But they didn't know they were doing it. The awareness of having a mind, the ability to look inward and observe your own thinking as a separate act, is not a feature that came built into the human brain. It was a discovery, one of the most consequential discoveries in the history of our species, and the evidence suggests it happened far more recently than anyone expected, in a specific window of time, triggered by specific conditions. By the end of this, you'll understand not just when humans first realized they had a mind, but what that realization changed, about how we live, how we suffer, how we love, and why the moment it happened may be the single most important event in human history that no one ever talks about. There's one piece of evidence, a text written approximately 2,800 years ago, that captures this transition more clearly than anything else ever found. We'll get there. But first, you need to understand what it means to not know you have a mind. Imagine you've never looked in a mirror, not because mirrors didn't exist, but because the concept of a reflection, the idea that what you're seeing is you, hasn't occurred to you yet. You would still have a face. You would still have expressions, features, a physical self that others could see clearly. You just wouldn't have access to it yourself. Psychologists call the ability to recognize yourself in a mirror self-awareness. And it turns out this is not a universal animal capacity. It's rare. The mirror test, developed by psychologist Gordon Gallup Jr. in 1970, places an animal in front of a mirror after marking its body with a spot it can only see in the reflection. Animals with self-awareness touch the spot on their own body. Animals without it treat the reflection as another animal. Humans pass the test by 18 months. Great apes pass it. Dolphins pass it. Elephants pass it. A handful of birds pass it. Most animals don't. But here's the thing the mirror test doesn't measure. Physical self-recognition is not the same as psychological self-awareness. Knowing you have a body is not the same as knowing you have a mind. The capacity to look inward, to observe your own thoughts, emotions, and mental states as objects of attention is called metacognition. And the archaeological, linguistic, and neurological evidence all point to the same conclusion. Metacognition, true psychological self-awareness, arrived very late in human history. Not in evolutionary terms, in historical terms. We are talking about a few thousand years ago. Maybe less. And the man who first made this argument, a Princeton psychologist who published his theory in 1976, was dismissed by most of his colleagues as having gone too far. He hadn't gone far enough. Julian Jaynes spent his career at Princeton studying the history of consciousness. In 1976, he published a book called The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. The title is academic. The argument is not. Jaynes proposed that prior to approximately 1000 BCE, roughly 3,000 years ago, humans did not experience themselves as conscious agents with an inner life. Instead, they experienced their own thoughts, impulses, and decisions as voices coming from outside themselves. Not metaphorically, literally. When ancient humans faced a difficult decision, Jaynes argued, they heard a voice, a command, an instruction, and they attributed that voice not to their own mind, because they had no concept of an internal mind, but to gods, ancestors, or external authorities. The voices were real neurological events. The left hemisphere of the brain generating language and decision guidance, the right hemisphere experiencing it as external, because the corpus callosum, the bridge between hemispheres, was not yet integrated enough to identify the voice as self-generated. Janes called this the bicameral mind, two chambers, one generating, one receiving. His theory was controversial. It still is. Many neuroscientists dispute the specific mechanism, but the historical evidence he assembled was harder to dismiss. Because when you read the oldest human texts, the earliest written records of what it felt like to be a person in ancient history, something is strikingly absent. There is no inner life. The Iliad is one of the oldest written texts in Western history. Scholars date its composition to approximately 800 BCE, though it describes events several centuries earlier. Read it carefully and you'll notice something that takes a moment to land. The characters in the Iliad don't decide anything. Not in the way you decide things. They don't deliberate. They don't weigh options. They don't experience internal conflict between competing desires. When Achilles acts, he acts because a god told him to. When Agamemnon makes a disastrous choice, it's because a god sent him a false dream. When any character in the Iliad does anything, good or catastrophic, the motivation is always external, divine, coming from outside the self. Janes argued this wasn't poetic convention. It was an accurate description of how those people experienced their own mental life. They didn't have an inner voice they recognized as their own. They had voices they recognized as divine. And then, in a window between approximately 900 and 600 BCE, something shifted. The gods went quiet. Not in theology, in experience. The voices that had guided human behavior for millennia began to be experienced differently. Less as external commands, more as internal suggestions. And humans, for the first time, began to ask a question that had never been asked before. Who is speaking? The answer they arrived at, slowly, across generations, across cultures simultaneously, was the most consequential answer in human history. Me. I am speaking. This is my mind. These are my thoughts. And I am the one who decides what to do with them. This is not a philosophical statement. It was a neurological event, a cultural shift that rewired how human beings related to their own inner experience. And the text that captures this transition more clearly than any other is not a philosophical treatise. It's not a scientific document. It's a poem. The Odyssey was composed approximately 50 to 100 years after the Iliad. Same tradition. Same poet, according to legend. Different human beings. Read the Odyssey after the Iliad and the difference is immediate. Odysseus, unlike any character in the Iliad, deliberates. He weighs, he plans, he experiences internal conflict. He considers options and chooses between them based on his own reasoning. He has an inner life. In one passage, he debates internally whether to attack immediately or wait, and the text describes him talking to his own heart. Not to a god, to himself. Janes called this passage one of the most significant moments in all of literature, not for its poetic quality, for what it reveals about the human beings who wrote it and read it. They had discovered the mind, not invented it, discovered it. The capacity was always there. The awareness of it was new, and once humans became aware that they had an inner life, that there was a self inside them that could observe, deliberate, and choose, everything changed. Not all at once, not everywhere simultaneously, but the shift was underway, and it was irreversible. The neuroscience of this transition is where the investigation gets genuinely complex, because Janes's specific mechanism, the bicameral brain, has been challenged. But the broader phenomenon he described has found unexpected support from a direction he never anticipated. In the 1990s, neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga at UC Santa Barbara published decades of research on split brain patients, people whose corpus callosum had been surgically severed to treat severe epilepsy. What he found was remarkable. When the two hemispheres were disconnected, they functioned as separate cognitive systems, each with its own perceptions, intentions, and responses. And crucially, each unaware of what the other was doing. The left hemisphere, the language hemisphere, would confabulate. When presented with actions generated by the right hemisphere that it had no knowledge of, it would immediately generate a plausible explanation. A story. A reason. It wouldn't say, "I don't know why I did that." It would say, "I did it because..." And then it would invent a reason, confidently, immediately, without any access to the actual cause. Gazzaniga called this the interpreter, the left hemisphere's relentless drive to construct a narrative of selfhood, to generate a continuous, coherent story of who you are and why you do what you do, even when that story is confabulated. This is the mechanism of human self-awareness, not a transparent window into your own mind. A storyteller, a narrator that constructs a version of your inner life in real time, and presents that construction to you as reality. You don't observe your mind directly. You observe the story your left hemisphere tells about your mind. And for most of human history, that story didn't include a narrator. The story didn't have a self in it. It had gods, voices, commands from outside, until it didn't. The question the archaeologists and cognitive scientists have been trying to answer for decades is, what caused the shift? Why in that specific window, roughly 900 to 600 BCE, did human beings across multiple unconnected civilizations begin developing explicit concepts of the inner self? Greece, India, China, and the Hebrew world all show this transition happening within a few centuries of each other. Philosophers in Athens, the Upanishads in India, Confucius in China, the Hebrew prophets shifting from the voice of God commanding to the inner experience of moral struggle, the same transition, different languages, different cultures, no contact between them. Something global was happening. The leading explanation from cognitive historians, specifically from researchers like Merlin Donald at Queen's University, is a technology argument. Writing. The invention and spread of writing, particularly phonetic alphabets, that allowed full language to be externalized, gave humans their first tool for observing their own thoughts from the outside. When you write a thought down, you can look at it, examine it, disagree with it, recognize it as separate from you. Before writing, thoughts were experienced as they occurred, fast, sequential, unreviewable. They passed through consciousness and were gone. There was no way to hold a thought still and observe it. Writing made thought an object, something that could be seen, examined, reflected upon, and reflection on thought, the ability to look at your own thinking, is the foundation of metacognition. The alphabet didn't just change how humans communicated. It changed how humans experienced themselves. It gave them the ability to see their own minds, and once they could see them, they could no longer unsee them. Here's what this means for you, right now, in this moment. The self-awareness you experience, the sense of being a person behind your eyes, watching your thoughts form, able to step back from them and evaluate them, is not a given. It's not a default. It's an invention, a discovery, something that arrived in human experience within the last 3,000 years and spread slowly, unevenly, through cultures and generations. And it came with a cost that no one who discovered it could have anticipated. Before metacognition, before humans knew they had minds, they couldn't ruminate. They couldn't replay past events obsessively. They couldn't construct elaborate, catastrophic futures and dread them for months in advance. The voices told them what to do. They did it. The voices were silent. There was no inner theater running continuous commentary on everything. When humans discovered the mind, they gained something profound, the ability to reason, to plan, to create, to build civilizations of philosophy and science and art. They also gained the ability to suffer in entirely new ways. Depression, the kind rooted in rumination, in self-criticism, in the relentless internal narrative that evaluates and finds lacking, is a metacognitive phenomenon. It requires an observer, a self that watches the self and renders judgment. Anxiety about the future requires the ability to simulate futures that don't exist. That requires a mind that knows it's a mind. The existential dread that sits quietly under modern human experience, the awareness of mortality, of meaninglessness, of the gap between what you are and what you could be, none of that is possible without metacognition. The gods didn't give us self-awareness. We discovered it ourselves, and we've been living with the consequences ever since. You are thinking right now. You know you're thinking. And somewhere in human history, at a table where someone first wrote down a thought and looked at it and recognized it as theirs, that sentence became possible for the first time. Not the thinking, the knowing. The voice that used to come from outside turned inward, and the human being who heard it, for the first time in the history of our species, said, "That's me." That moment, that specific, unrecorded, unremarkable moment that happened to someone, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, is the moment the modern human experience began. Everything you are capable of thinking, everything you are capable of feeling about your own life, every plan you've made and regret you've carried and hope you've held, all of it traces back to that moment. A voice turned inward, and a person realized they were the one speaking. If this is the kind of content that stays with you long after you stop watching, subscribe for new videos. This channel goes where the big questions live, and there's always another one worth asking.